Good afternoon. I'm John French, and welcome to the Cost of Magic, and also to Virtual Balticon. I think we can start with. Oh, by the way, before we start, you should be aware that this session is being recorded. Let's start with introductions. I'll start with Beth and go counterclockwise. Beth.
Hi all, I'm Beth Tanner. I am a writer and longtime fan, and I live between Baltimore and DC. And just as a warning, we may get a visit from one of my four-footed friends during the panel. I'll try to mute if that happens.
Oh, that's okay. We all like animals. Nick.
My name is Nick Martell. My debut, called The Kingdom of Liars, is out June 23rd from Saga Press. And yeah, I'm on this panel because the magic system in my book costs memories to use. So,
Hey, Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie. I write as Penelope. My epic fantasy series is the Ursinger Chronicles. The first book is Song of Blood and Stone, and the third book comes out in August, which is Cry of Metal and Bone.
Okay, and JL.
Hi, I'm JL Gribble. I am a urban fantasy alternate history writer. My series is called The Steel Empires. Steel Victory is the first one, and a special edition with bonus content is coming out July 15th, but there are 5 in the series so far.
Very good. My name is John L. French. I am a retired crime scene investigator. I'm a writer and an editor, and one of my most current books is The Magic of Simon Toombs, stories about a gentleman adventurer with a taste for magic. And I think we can get started. Keeping the same order, Beth, how are you involved in magic?
I write a lot of epic fantasy and high fantasy, much of which involves magic.
Okay, and Nick, I think you answered, but
yep.
How are you involved with magic?
I pretty much the same thing. I write epic fantasy with magic that costs memories to use. So,
Leslie?
Yeah, I write epic fantasy and paranormal romance and it's a little urban fantasy sort of. So my magic, I like magic systems and world building in general. And I think that magic is really interesting. So I wish I was involved in real life in more than just writing, but that's all I have.
Okay, and JL?
In my series, in the Steel Empires, magic exists, and I have 2 different forms of magic, and there's definitely cost involved. I try to have an internal logic structure, pretty scientific about it, in my elemental and my primordial magic and how they combine.
Okay. Well, since you've already started it, what different kinds of magic are out there?
It depends on the source mythology that you're going from. It depends on the type of genre that you're writing in, which has a lot to do with reader expectation. And I think probably the more realistic magic systems that I've ever read have always had some sort of cost associated with them and not just hand wavy anything is possible, because that's easy and that gets boring to read.
Okay. Leslie?
Yeah, I tend to write internal magic systems as opposed to external. And I think it's just kind of worldview. I was talking with another author, with actually Jeffy Kennedy, who writes fantasy romance also. And I was interviewing her about her magic system for my podcast. And it was similar because we both talked about how we create our magic systems based on personal philosophy. And so for me, like internal, where in terms of it's active, but you don't need extra things. You don't need potions and herbs and spells and incantations. It's inside of you, and it's something that you use. I think that there's just so many different types that it's only limited by your imagination. I mean, I think memory sounds really awesome. I had never thought of magic based on ingesting metal until I read Brandon Sanderson. So you can sort of go anywhere with it. And I think the kind of wilder places you go make for really interesting stories and interesting conflict in terms of when you do need extra external supplies for it, as opposed to, or some even internal magic when it costs something internal that is also really interesting and really could be a good basis for conflict and for all kinds of stories to come out of it.
And internal can be memories like Nick writes, or it can even just be like calories.
Yeah.
The act of using magic burns energy because it's a muscle that you're using like anything else.
Nick?
Yeah, so to me, I like the magic systems that always have high costs, because to me, they're a little more interesting. That I never wanted a system that could create less problems for my characters. I wanted my magic, the moment they used it, to create more problems for them. So I internalized, try to figure out what's the worst thing that I could cause my characters to lose. And to me, it was memories, because you think about how much like you grow and learn, and how much of your early life is based on like how you were brought up and how you see things in the world. Losing pieces can really affect your worldview if you no longer have these support systems. So it was kind of like, okay, I don't want to like kill characters or like do these other costs that are kind of too severe for me. What's a good cost that I can still torment my characters, keep them alive, and have them like change perspectives throughout the novel? And that was how I created this memory system. And then it just went out of control, and it affected my entire world building.
Okay. And Beth?
I'm going to pivot a little bit off something Nick just said, which is that I think that magic systems are really fundamental to world building. If we make magic too inexpensive, even calorically, to use JL's flavor, then it sets it up to be, I don't want to say all powerful, but more powerful than it could be. And I think the idea of putting a cost on it, whether it's a like Nick's memory cost or a physical cost or an emotional like exhaustion level cost, or your blue mana bar goes down, or whatever it is that you're doing, is the thing that like is going to shape how magic interacts with your world.
Okay. I've as a reader, both in fantasy and urban fantasy and things like that, I've seen again different kinds of magic based on belief, magic based on natural resources. It's either internal, it's learned. In my Simon Tombs story, there's it's the universe will exact a cost. The cost is basically varies on what you're asking the how you're trying to twist the universe. And there's also Simon sometimes will gather power by journeying to hell and freeing repentant souls. Their energy comes to him, and then he can use it however he wants. So not necessarily with your own books, but what are the different kinds of costs of the magics that you've read about or seen on television or whatever? Beth?
I got one. Yeah.
Okay.
So one that came out a year or two ago is a long short story by Sarah Pinsker called The Court Magician. It was in Lightspeed in, I think, maybe 2018. And it involves both loss of memories, but also loss of body parts by the magician as they do magic to support the local nobility. And so it starts with a finger and goes from there. And it's both really hard to read, but also really, really well done.
Okay. Let me just interrupt for a minute. When we started off, I should have told our attendees that if you have questions, feel free to ask questions. Down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something called Q&A. Type them in, and probably about midway through our panel, we will start addressing those questions. Okay. Nick, what kinds of magic and its cost have you seen?
I'll take the obvious one with Mistborn. It's pretty much ingesting metals. And it's really interesting how he created that world where you think of someone ingesting metals like, oh, this is going to kill them. It actually gives them powers and abilities that affect the world around them. So you have these characters who I'm trying to think of how much to spoil, which seems kind of weird to spoil a book that's so well known, but he creates a system that has the cost of, like, if you run out of metal in your body, you can no longer use your power. So you have to figure out how to, like, adapt and affect the world, and also at the same time, like, the world reacts back, like metals are more scarce in places, to stop these magicians and people coming in to essentially beat them. So
Okay. Now, whereas it just could be just metals, or is it something like, if I want this power, I ingest gold. If I want this power, I ingest iron. If I want to die, I ingest mercury. You know, things like, is it just has to be metal?
it's very specific metals. For each person, they have, like, depending on what they are, they ingest certain metals to get certain powers. But not everyone can ingest, like, all metals to get all the powers. It's very specific depending on what their like specialty is.
Okay. Leslie.
I think that an interesting cost of magic, which is sort of ancillary, is how people are treated who have magic in the world, because it's not a direct cost, but especially in books that have worlds where they're not accepted, or they're even subjugated for having magic, where they're feared, all of those things, or depending on what it is, there's different stratifications. So it becomes a societal factor, and it becomes just like another metaphor for all the different things that keep people apart in society. And so that's one of the things about having it be completely integrated into the world. Like one of the questions, and I think it was a Holly Black question, or it might have been someone else, but what makes it so that people with this magic don't take over the world? And that can be if it's costing them body parts or memories or just exhaustion. And it can also be that they are highly controlled and regulated, and just so because of the fear of them actually taking over the world. And that's something that's really important to consider when you're creating a magic system, is like, how does it affect relationships and the culture of the people who have it and the culture of the people who don't have it, and politics and all of the other things that aren't actually just the doing of the magic.
AL?
I really enjoy the different types of magics that Mercedes Lackey uses in her Valdemar series, especially because there's like 30 plus novels at this point that cover hundreds of years, and hand wavy magic exists, but then there's also mind magic and like telekinesis and telepathy, but in a culture that doesn't have words for those, there's still a cost associated with them, just even in terms of, oh, I overused my gift, so I have a headache. And she does a good job of subtly incorporating the limits that Leslie was talking about in terms of the majority of the people who have these powers, what stops them from taking over the world is the external factor of the herald system that she's developed of people who end up becoming protectors of the society.
Okay. I've always liked, I'm a big Larry Niven fan, and he had a series of books of where the magic was a natural resource that you drew from the earth. And if a wizard stayed in an area too long, his powers would become less and less, because he was drawing, basically he was exhausting the earth of its magic. And so eventually a magician would have to move on to another area in order to renew his power. So magic was a natural resource. We burnt, we drew it from the earth, we burned it out, and we had to move on. Pretty much any other resource that we've got now, coal, oil, something like that. We use it up, we promiscuously use it up, and we're going to lose it. The first story I read in that was about a barbarian versus a barbarian with an enchanted sword versus the magician, which is the way nature keeps control, because any magician who can't defeat a barbarian could not have been a very good magician, and any barbarian who can defeat a magician must be a very, very good barbarian. So it was basically weeding out the weak barbarians and the weak magicians. I think the novel he wrote after that was called Magic Goes Away, followed up, of course, with The Magic May Return. Okay. I'll answer a question here. What is everybody's what is everyone's favorite magical system they have encountered in any context? And I'll expand that to which fictional magicians or sorcerers or magic users, however you want to call them, do you enjoy reading? Other than your own, of course.
Can I expand it to watching?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
The magicians, and I cannot, for the life of me, stand that book trilogy, but the television adaptation is one of the best urban fantasies I've seen on TV, and they've bounced back and forth across seasons from having too little magic to now what do we do that there's too much magic. And it's a really interesting take on how they use it in terms of both internal intention, but also doing cool things with their fingers to kind of have an effect on the physical world. And one of the creepiest villains I've ever seen was from season 1, who literally gave himself extra fingers so that he could do more of that magic.
Good idea. And where can this be found?
The Magicians TV series, it just finished. It was on Sci-Fi. I'm pretty sure the first few seasons at least are on Netflix now. And I don't recommend the books for various reasons, but I highly recommend the show.
That's kind of odd that you don't like the books, but you like the TV show. What got you reading? If you didn't like the books, what got you watching the TV show?
I watched the first season of the show and absolutely loved it. So I bought all 3 of the books and read them in a week on a cruise. And then said, well, that was worthless. And I still adore the show.
Okay. Beth?
I was thinking back to I'm going to go with an author who has a bunch of kind of interrelated magic systems, which is this sort of low magic of Charles DeLint. So,
excellent writer.
It's all very sort of close to the earth and close to the person, getting a little bit to Leslie's point about it being personal or internal magic rather than necessarily external, although there's some external implications and external features. And I think that he's just done a lot of different interesting things with that kind of internal and not earth-shattering magic, but very close to the earth and intimate magic.
Okay, Nick?
Probably the best magic system that I've really encountered. It's such a hard question. The one that's like sticking out to me though is Full Metal Alchemist. It's a manga and anime, and it lives by like a very basic principle. It's like equivalent exchange. You can create and transform and make things different, but it costs equivalent price. And you think it's a very basic system. It's based on alchemy of like turning lead to gold, but figuring how much like energy and resources turn lead into gold is really fascinating. And the whole concept and how the story shapes around this one basic premise is really fascinating to me.
I've always liked, I mentioned Larry Niven. There's a friend of mine who writes a magic book, a series about a magician, Patrick Thomas. He writes the Hex series. And Hex is pretty much an all-powerful magician. He can do what he wants, but the price he pays is in pain. A small magic's cause small pain. If he tries to do a big magic, then he's better. He loads up on pain pills first because he knows what's coming.
I like magic that's a little complicated to learn. So it's more, I guess it kind of crosses into a technological thing where there's levels and you actually have to study and to get to the next level to gain more power. There's an author named Kate Stradling who has a book called Namesake, which is one of my favorites. And because it's an intricate system that has to be learned, and the main character is teaching this magic to other people throughout the book. And it's just, yeah, like the quote about, you know, magic being indistinguishable from technology. I never remember exactly how it goes, but those types of things, when it's systematized in a way that is really organized. Like I like soft magic too sometimes, and I think there's a place that probably just talk about, you know, kind of more soft magic versus hard magic. But personally, I really love when it's systematized and it's like there's rules that you have to learn and go up the levels. And there was a question earlier about the 5th season and K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy and whether that is magic or not. And I think it's along those lines. Like, I'm not sure. It feels like it's orogeny is what it's called, and it feels like it's like physiological in some way. Like people are born with, you know, sesapine, and there's these things in your brain that allow you to interact with the earth and the geological forces and things like that. So is it magic, or is that just advanced science fiction? Exactly. Yeah. Any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from science. So, or was it the other way around?
Yeah. Well, actually, Leslie, you brought up 2 interesting topics that I think we can explore. The first is you mentioned teaching magic. And when I hear teaching magic, I think of everybody, well, most everybody's favorite boy wizard, Harry Potter. So what kind of prices were paid by the people? I mean, if you're all familiar, is there anybody here who's not familiar with Harry Potter? Yeah, what kind of prices did they pay? I mean, Harry looked like he had, I mean, he was at least a potential for being a great wizard, but he looked like he had a pretty miserable life, at least a part of it depicted in chronicled by J.K. Rowling.
Well,
What kind of prices did the wizards in the Harry Potter universe have to pay?
I think they paid more of a cultural price in terms of how far behind they were, in terms of keeping up technologically and culturally with the rest of the world, because they'd cut themselves off from the Muggle world. And, you know, I always wonder, like, magic solves all these problems, but then, you know, they still have all these, they have no idea how to interact with the greater world. And I think that our society is going to hamstring themselves sooner or later because of how, you know, approaching the singularity the rest of the world is in terms of technology level. So
yeah, did their magic actually have a cost? I don't think so. It's very soft. It's
really,
very, you know, hand wavy.
No.
But I do think it was a personal cost, a relationship cost, a societal cost, like you said, as opposed to that more. It's like a school for magic, and they're learning magic, but kind of. I don't know. It's not systematized in the way that I was kind of talking about. Like it's
No, as long as you can speak Latin, you can perform magic.
Latin-ish, and you have the right kind of wand, and you know,
Right,
there's
yes,
things
so
that you need to do. But yeah, it doesn't seem to cost anything, which is a lot of people's criticism of it.
It seemed to be kind of a natural magic where you had to be born with it, born with the magical gene, and then you had the right tools, and then after that, you know, you were just drawing from a source that could have been anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most, like JL said, it was mostly a sociological price they paid because they were cut off from the mundane world, which is pretty much the stereotype of any classical magician in literature. They're isolated, you know, and not, you know, they might know how to do magic. They don't know that there's a civil war raging in the kingdom next door that might affect them.
There's another muddled magic system that really bothered me was the Witcher TV show. I never read the books, but I had this whole rant on Twitter about the Witcher magic system and how it didn't make any sense at all. And it totally contradicted itself all the time. And it drove me absolutely insane. And I guess that would be more of a soft magic because they didn't bother to put any rules in place on the TV show.
well, I think I haven't read the books, but I watched a lot of The Witcher 3 getting played, and I did watch the show. And I think it's a symptom of there were multiple magic systems going on, that the show kind of assumes that you knew about, and so that's why things start contradicting themselves a lot. So I totally understand why you were irritated with it.
Yeah, I mean, having, like Harry Potter, we only see the magic really having a negative effect when they're trying to do really, really over the top things, or people like Voldemort and his followers who are really being greedy about power in a way, versus I don't see a huge, I mean, even the societal cost is largely by choice, not by, and not entirely by, you know, it's not being imposed upon them externally. It's by selection, except for, you know, Mr. Weasley, who spends all of his time figuring out how technology things work.
This is where
And-
I embrace the irony that I'm wearing a Harry Potter t-shirt right now.
Oh, wonderful. Nick, you want to weigh in or?
No, I think everyone kind of said what I was going to. Like Harry Potter has like a kind of societal cost, but even that is kind of like they can change it if they wanted to. They just don't.
Yeah.
It's almost a problem of the magical school narrative, where the school becomes such the focus that the larger anything beyond that kind of starts falling apart in terms of world building.
And I wonder if that's not part of the problem with the Grindelwald books, the Grindelwald movies, is that they have tried to interact with the rest of the world and not done a great job.
All right, and the other thing Leslie mentioned was, you know, I forget who said it, but it's sufficient. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, if you look at the technology we have available to us, even to the point of remote viewing, you know, we're all living in different places, but we can all see each other and hear each other. We have at our fingertips, you know, on our phones, the sum of the world's knowledge. We have all this, which would be considered essentially magic 150 years ago and would have gotten us burned 500 years ago. What price have we paid for the magic that we're using?
I think we're kind of seeing it now in terms of being isolated, you know, being on lockdown or whatever you want to call it. And the benefit is, you know, we can do things like this, and that's great. But I think that it's shown the holes in it. And there's some article that I read about how interacting on video chat is something with your brain, because you don't get the full body, you don't get the cues of, you know, people's body language and things like that. So there is some sort of distance. And so the more that technology allows us to interact without being together in real life, which has benefits to it, but it has these strong detriments in terms of just interpersonal communications, and like dating online has made the marriage rate go down, I think, like just things like that are, you can't predict it. And because you would think that it would do something different than it does. It underscores how important human interpersonal relationships taking place in the same place actually are.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Or has Leslie said it all?
Did I depress everyone?
Yes. All right, and one more topic before we get into the questions and answering. Since we talked about Harry Potter, let's talk about Star Wars. Are the users of the Force, be they Jedis or, you know, the Darths or what have you, you know, should they be considered magicians? And if so, what price are they paying?
I feel like that depends on whether you acknowledge the existence of the prequels or not.
Well, I think that's the price we pay.
Which retcon are you subscribing to?
Pardon?
I said, which retcon are you subscribing to? Is it midichlorians or, you know?
Well, the midichlorians would be something akin to the whatever gene causes the Harry Potter wizards and witches to be able to do magic. But I just, you know, you can just kind of pick and choose. But in general, you know, the Jedis, they can do wonderful things with their mind. You know, but what price, you know, we could see in at least episode 2, what price a lot of the Jedis paid. Would Luke Skywalker have been a happier person had he not been a Jedi and things like that? So is there a price there that they paid?
It doesn't seem like the Force itself as a magic system has a cost to it. There might be some sort of energetic, you know, I'm exhausted after I use it cost. But they also kept adding powers and abilities to it as it went on. But yeah, I think that, you know, that's one of those things where it's a societal thing where to be a knight, you had to not have a family and, you know, be somewhat isolated, I guess, from the other society, even though it's a privilege, ostensibly.
It's like it's a mental discipline cost.
Yeah.
To be a Jedi Knight. And the implication is if you don't have that mental discipline, or you cheat and use more negative emotions to access that power, then you end up becoming evil and becoming a Sith.
Right.
But somebody who joins the dark side, cookies notwithstanding, you know, do they pay the price, or does everybody else pay the price for them?
Of being a victim of them, basically.
Yes, I mean, you know, Darth Vader, you know, he seemed to be till the episode 6, he seemed to be really enjoying himself, but everybody around him was paying the price.
It's like the price of any villain. I think that, you know, they're having a great time until they get defeated by the hero, and everybody else around them is definitely paying the cost. So it's not magical. It's just like morality. It's a moral cost. And
Okay. One of our attendees, Nina Smith, posted on the comments, the price of Jedi Force power is becoming a pompous oath.
well said.
Yes. Okay, let's open things up to questions. Starting with the first one, Grace has been very patient. Thank you for your patience, Grace. What are your favorite fresh takes on basic, and Grace defines basic as European folktale magic systems? I think Beth, you mentioned or somebody mentioned the Charles DeLint, which seems to be a nice take on the European folk tales.
Yeah, I would throw that in, and then I would also throw in, I guess it counts, American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Oh, wonderful.
As a perhaps less savory take on what happens when, you know, European magic comes to the US.
Okay, anyone else?
Kind of in the same vein as American Gods, I really enjoy some of the takes that the show Supernatural has had on magic, because they've kind of embraced more than just the Eurocentric. One of my favorite episodes of that show is when the deities of various other faiths get together to try to figure out what are we going to do about God and Satan duking it out, and how do we basically survive this. So I think it's really easy to, and totally not meaning to denigrate your question at all, Grace, please don't think I'm doing that, but just don't always assume that basic magic has its roots in anything Eurocentric. There's so much source and mythology available all over the world to mine for inspiration for your writing, and I love the fact that that publishing is starting to embrace voices from other cultures in terms of having their fantasy and literature out there next. That fell apart, but you know what I'm saying.
Nick, Leslie?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Like, I think that, I don't know that much about European folktales in general, but I really liked Uprooted. And I know that was a take on some sort of European folklore. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Next question is from Rachel. If you're familiar with Brandon Sanderson's laws of magic, what do you think of them and how do they relate to the cost of magic? I will be the first to say I'm not at all familiar with Brandon Sanderson's writing, so I will leave it up to the rest of you. Anybody want to weigh in?
I'm not familiar either, sorry.
I do. Do you know, Nick?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what they all are.
I looked it up. So the first one is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic.
Yep.
Which is really, and then the second one is limitations is greater than power, I think.
Yeah. So I 100% agree with them. I honestly think magic should be, if it's being used to solve a problem, it should come out with a massive cost. And that's kind of what he's pretty much saying. Like, if you have someone who can hand wave like your plot in 5 seconds, then your magic is either too overpowered or your plot is too easy to fix. We read stories to be like the struggles of people, not just like their moments of like victory. So if something comes too easy, then the reader won't be fulfilled reading the story as they would if the system was a little bit more harder to do. But I think his last rule is like essentially the rule of awesome, where he literally is like, but if it's awesome, do it. Like if you really want like something, a dragon to fly in, and it makes no sense magic wise, do it. Yeah.
And that the first one about the reader has to understand the magic, or else it just feels sort of like Deus Ex Machina or hand wavy. You know, you do have to, if you're writing something and you get to the end and you realize, oh, this really cool, awesome thing's going to happen with the magic, you do have to go back and layer in so that the reader understands early that this is possible, so it doesn't come out of nowhere and feels like, oh, you were just, spitballing as you went along, and that just feels cheap. I mean, there are plenty of stories that don't apply to these rules, and we've talked about soft magic and magic that doesn't make any sense in very successful, works. So it's not necessary, but I think that there's a certain, we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about how it doesn't make sense, and so it depends on what you're focusing on. But overall, I do think the laws make sense to me.
Okay. Nick, we got a comment here from Maria. It says, Brandon Sanderson's magic has a lot to do with metal and his Mistborn series. I was curious as to whether you Nick, had read that series.
Yep, I've read all of them. They're
Okay.
great. They're fantastic.
All right. The next is from Miguel. What is the most unpleasant magical system in terms of cost that you've read about?
Someone else answer while I Google something.
Okay. I think somebody
I'm gonna stick
mentioned
with my first one.
the loss of body parts was fairly unpleasant.
That is very unpleasant.
Yes.
I'm totally blanking on the series, but it starts with a girl who is essentially raised by wolves, and there are like greater versions of animals that have the sentience of humans, but then later in the series, the main character encounters people who have been using magic and using it essentially like deforms parts of their bodies, and the scariest people are the ones that you can't see their deformities, because like what have they actually sacrificed in order to still look human? Yes, Firekeeper series by Jane Linsgold. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. It's not necessarily unpleasant, but it is the saddest cost I've ever heard. And I apologize, I cannot remember either the author or the story, but it was about a magician who he wants to do something great. He wants to be a famous magician. And so, and he keeps having the opportunity to do it, but somebody always beats him to it. And he goes into this village, and there's a dragon or wicked overlord or something that he has to defeat. So he puts everything he's got into defeating this evil. And it's a great battle, and he does wonderful things, and the evil is defeated. And then it turns out, well, the reader knows this, but he doesn't. The cost of his magic is that he will never be able to remember his successful magic. So to him, he may have done dozens of great things, but he doesn't remember any of them.
So he'd never know it.
He doesn't know he's done great things. He keeps thinking he's second or third rate because he isn't able to do anything wonderful, and he keeps doing wonderful things. And the cost of doing wonderful things is you never know you've done wonderful things.
Mm.
That to me was like one of the saddest fantasy stories I've ever read.
Yeah, for me, Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. And it's a huge spoiler, but they can create new bodies for these people, but they need teeth. And so they're like chimeras, they're creations of different animals, but in order to look human, you would need baby teeth. And so they have to collect, these teeth, and it's horrifying and heartbreaking, and it's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it.
Are we talking tooth fairies here?
Not at all.
Okay.
No.
I think one of the worst costs of magic I've ever seen is the price of being a vampire. Like, you can't go out in the sun, you can't eat anything garlic, which is like half of what I cook with. So everything would taste bland. You have to live in a coffin. It's terrible. And
I mean, it depends on what your vampirism is. Full disclosure, in my urban fantasy with magic, I also have vampires, and there's definitely some costs. But yeah, it depends on what source and how you're adapting your vampires. But yeah, I would miss garlic too.
All right, now who's paying the bigger price, a vampire or a werewolf?
I was just thinking about that, actually, because one of my favorite, probably ever, books is The Night in the Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny.
Yes.
And in it, each of the characters has their own sort of limitations in terms of their magical, both abilities and, capabilities.
I mean, if we're talking classic werewolves, it's just like full moon once a month. I think the vampire has the worst of that deal.
And silver, but then it has to actually penetrate. So
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on. Andrew asked a rather long question. While every story, world, and magic system is different, how much do you all prefer a defined, systematic, known magic system versus a more fluid, undefined, and unpredictable magic system? Think Rothfuss's Name of the Wind, sympathy versus naming. How do you figure the best fit for your story? So how do you, I guess if Andrew, if I get this wrong, I apologize, but do you prefer a defined magic system versus a fluid magic system? And which have you chosen for your story?
I have strong opinions.
Well, I think it's whatever best serves the story that you're trying to tell. Because I certainly I've enjoyed both forms of magic, but it really has to serve the conflict and the plot and the characters.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me at least, I have to know what the rules and limitations are, although the characters may or may not. I have to know what the structure is so that I can let it influence what things happen in the world building and what things happen in the storyline. But the characters may or may not see all of that iceberg. There's a lot of framework behind the scenes that they may not see.
And when it's very systematized, you do have to spend a longer time explaining it to the audience. And so is that going to take away from the other parts of the plot? Is that an important part of the plot, or is it that you need this thing to happen? So you have to just figure out the weight of explaining and making sure the audience is aware of all of these intricate magical rules, as opposed to, okay, we're going to do this thing. So they both have their place.
Or does it get back to your Deus Ex Machina where,
right?
Oh, and then he suddenly pulls out his wand and all the bad guys are dead.
Exactly.
I was, being a mystery fan and also a fantasy fan, I've always enjoyed the Randall Garrett, Lord Darcy stories. which is set in a world where science never truly advanced and alchemy took over. And so magic exists, but it's he subtly defines the different, the limitations of magic. Perhaps one of the reasons I like it is Lord Darcy is a king's investigator, and his assistant is a forensic magician. Now, I was a forensic scientist for 40 years, but I would have loved to have been a forensic. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah. So I like hard systems, but I see the appeal in like having soft systems that you still have that wondrous like magicness where things can change. So when I was creating the system for my world, it has very hard rules, and just like Beth was saying, like my characters may or may not know the limitations. But one of the things I really wanted to do with it is that I wanted my magic to evolve. So having hard lines in the sand where like it can't do this is nice, but I also wanted them to be like, if my people are clever enough that they can come up with like different limitations and pushing past what people thought for years, okay, this is the limitation of magic. But if they can do it in a different way, then they're pushing it past, essentially creating new magic.
That gets back to the magic is indistinguishable from science progress. Yeah. I really like that.
Or just the internal physics of whatever you're using. I wanted to write a time travel book in my series, so I figured out how time travel worked within my magic system.
We are getting near toward the end of time, so let me try to pick some quick questions. Apologies to those who asked questions and we weren't able to get to them. When magic goes wrong, this is from Sylvia. When magic goes wrong, could that also be considered a type of cost?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and depending on how wrong, it could be, personally damaging or, globally damaging or anything in between.
All right, another quick question. This is from Sarah. As an author, do you make a conscious decision whether or not to show magic on your characters? Example, glowing eyes, etc., etc.
Yeah, I did. The only people who can see magic itself are the people who are magic users. Non-magic users can certainly see some effects, but like I use the whole thing of magic users have like shields around themselves, but only other magic users can see those shields.
Yeah, in an early draft, I had it so that people could tell when someone was using magic. And then it occurred to me that it'd be more conflict if they couldn't tell. So you didn't even know who had magic, because in my world, magic gets stolen by the antagonist. And so he steals all his people's magic. And so you don't know who has it and who doesn't. And that just opened up more story opportunities. But in other series and other stories and other magic systems, sometimes it is helpful to have it be like glowing eyes, or they're doing something with their hands or something. So kind of have to figure out if it's going to help you or which one is going to help the story the most.
Yeah, I think it depends entirely on context and what you need to have happen for story purposes.
Okay. In my Simon Toombs story, Simon is a casual user of magic, and he very seldom, unless it's for effect, he very seldom displays, shows any signs of him using magic. On the other hand, he has a fallen angel as an assistant / companion. And when you tick her off, she will allow her demonic aspects to come forward. And everybody knows she's about to do something. Okay. Let's see. All right. Do we have have you read about different magic systems on different planets in the same story universe?
No, but that sounds amazing.
All right. Thank you for your second question, Miguel. And you've just given 5 authors really good ideas for their next stories.
Right.
I'm gonna say that's in my book.
I was gonna say,
Good.
you do,
Awesome.
you do get different magical systems in the same world in a couple of things where you end up with, well, this is how mine works, but that's not how yours works, and oops.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do
but,
that.
like,
I have like 4 different
literally-
magic systems in the world. There's blood magic and earth song and like life magic and death magic, and they're different, but they can be combined. So, but having different worlds and different magics is really cool.
And it depends
Um,
on whether it's like different worlds in terms of alternate universes or portal fantasy, or literally like I'm gonna get on
Okay.
my spaceship and go to a different world, and
It's a
the
whole different magic. Yeah.
Right.
on that
I
front.
just got a message from our tech. We're about to run out of time, so let's give everybody, just do one go around. Tell everybody, say where they can find your books. Unfortunately, it's not this year in the dealer's room down on the 5th floor. But JL, where can people find information about you and your books?
Information about me can be found at jlgribble.com. You can find all about my series, and that is where my running book blog is. I read about 100, 150 books a year, and I review every single one of them. So jlgribble.com. Thank you.
Hey, Beth?
I am most frequently on Twitter, BT_musings, and I have some short fiction out that's linked there.
Hey, Leslie?
Penelope.com, and the first book in the series is Sound of Blood and Stone.
Okay. And where can we find that?
It's everywhere.
Everywhere. Good.
We're
And
booksellers.
Nick?
You can find me at Mac Martell on Twitter or nickmartell.com. My debut, Kingdom of Liars, comes out June 23rd, and bookstores, Amazon, booksellers everywhere. Pretty much.
That's a good title. And I said, my books, Magic of Simon Tombs and other books can be found on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, but in these times, I would like you, if you're interested in my books, please go to padwolfpublishing.com or boldventurepress.com. Buy them from the publisher. They need the money more than Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
Thank you, everybody.
And I think we're wrapping up. So I would like to thank. We hit over 100 participants, which is the most crowded panel I've ever been on. And it's a good thing. This time, I guess it's a good thing it was virtual, because I don't think we could have fit you all into a single room in the Renaissance. So until David, our tech, cuts us off, does anybody else have any final comments? Oh, I do. Oh, we have been cut off.